There is a story that has been told in the villages of Rajasthan for over 1,000 years. It has no author, it has no copyright, it has no publishing house behind it, no marketing budget, no algorithm optimizing its distribution. It has survived invasions, the collapse of empires, the arrival of printing, the invention of cinema, the birth of the internet, and it is still being told. Still being passed from grandmother to grandchild in the same cadence, with the same images, with the same moment of stillness just before the ending that makes the listener lean forward without knowing why. Now that same story, or versions of it, cousins of it, echoes of it, is appearing on the bestseller lists of London and New York and Toronto. It is being adapted into streaming series watched by audiences who cannot locate Rajasthan on a map. It is being studied in creative writing programs at universities that once taught their students that the only stories worth telling came from a very specific and very narrow tradition. Something is happening, and it is bigger than a publishing trend. It is bigger than diversity initiatives or multicultural marketing. It is a fundamental shift in what the world recognizes as a story worth telling, and why Indian folk tales specifically are proving to be exactly what that shift demands. Let's start with the thing that most publishing analyses miss entirely. Indian folk tales are not becoming popular because the world has suddenly become more curious about India. Curiosity about a culture does not sell books. Curiosity fades. Novelty exhausts itself. Indian folk tales are becoming global bestsellers because they solve a problem that contemporary storytelling has been struggling with for at least 2 decades. The problem is this: the dominant Western narrative tradition, the 3-act structure, the singular hero's journey, the linear progression from problem to resolution has been so thoroughly absorbed, so completely internalized, so relentlessly replicated across every platform and medium that audiences have developed a kind of structural exhaustion. They can feel the beat coming before it arrives. They know when the dark moment will land. They can predict the resolution from the setup, not because they are too clever, but because the template has become too visible. The story no longer surprises, it merely conforms. Indian folk tales operate on an entirely different architecture. They are not built around a single protagonist moving through a linear world. They are built around multiplicity, multiple voices, multiple timelines, multiple moral centers that do not resolve neatly into a single correct reading. They contain stories within stories, the Panchtantra structure, where a frame narrative holds an inner narrative which contains another narrative still, creating a kind of depth that feels less like reading and more like falling. They do not always end with justice. They do not always end with the good being rewarded and the wicked punished. They end with truth, which is a more complicated thing and a more satisfying one for an audience that has grown sophisticated enough to distrust the tidy conclusion. They are full of animals that speak with human wisdom, of gods that behave with human weakness, of demons that are capable of devotion, of heroes that are capable of failure. A moral universe so much richer and stranger than the one most Western narrative has trained its audience to expect. When a reader encounters that world for the first time, whether in a reimagined Panchtantra, a retold Ramayana, a Jataka tale made new by a contemporary author, the experience is not, "This is interesting and different." The experience is, "I did not know stories could do this." And that experience, that sudden expansion of what narrative feels possible, is the most powerful thing a book can produce. It is what turns readers into evangelists, what turns a bestseller into a cultural moment. But the structural innovation of Indian folk tales is only one part of the answer. The other part is timing. We are living through a particular moment in global culture, a moment of simultaneous fragmentation and reconnection. The internet has shattered the monoculture. There is no longer a single dominant narrative that the whole world consumes together. There are thousands of streams, thousands of communities, thousands of aesthetic traditions finding their own audiences without requiring the approval of the old gatekeepers. In that environment, specificity wins. The story that is rooted in a particular place, a particular tradition, a particular way of seeing the world, that story has more power than the story that was designed to appeal to everyone and therefore belongs fully to no one. Indian folk tales are among the most specifically rooted stories in human history. They come from a civilization that has been continuously accumulating narrative for 5,000 years. They carry the dust of specific landscapes, the Deccan Plateau, the Gangetic Plain, the forests of the Northeast, the coastal villages of Kerala. They carry the logic of specific cosmologies, the wheel of dharma, the concept of karma, the understanding of time not as a line, but as a cycle that returns to its own beginning. That rootedness, that absolute specificity is not a barrier to global audiences. It is the reason global audiences are drawn to them. Because the paradox of storytelling is that the more particular a story is, the more universal it becomes. The story that belongs completely to one place and one tradition touches something in every human being precisely because it is not trying to touch every human being. It is not performing universality, it is simply being itself, fully, without apology, and discovering that the self it is resonates across every border it was never designed to cross. One best-selling retelling alone does not define a movement, but patterns tell the truth. And the pattern here is unmistakable once you know where to look. Sudha Murthy's stories, rooted in the oral traditions of Karnataka, told with the simplicity and moral clarity of someone who learned narrative at her grandmother's feet, have sold millions of copies in languages she does not speak, in countries she has never visited, to readers who share none of her biographical context, but recognize something in her stories that they had been missing without knowing it. The Jaya retelling of the Mahabharata, Devdutt Patnayak's excavations of Hindu mythology, the explosion of Ramayana retellings told from the perspectives of its most complex figures, Sita, Kaikeyi, Shurpanakha, characters who were always present in the original, but whose interiority the tradition had not fully explored, all of it pointing in the same direction. The world is not just consuming Indian folktales as cultural artifact, it is consuming them as living narrative, as stories that have something to say about the present moment that the present moment's own stories are struggling to articulate. The Mahabharata, for instance, is not a story about ancient India. It is a story about what happens when a family tears itself apart over power and inheritance, about the impossible choices that arise when duty to nation conflicts with duty to loved ones, about the nature of justice in a world where every actor is both partially right and partially wrong. Has reasons that make sense from inside their own perspective. About war, its necessity, its horror, its aftermath, the way it changes everyone who survives it into someone their former self would not fully recognize. These are not ancient themes. These are this morning's headlines. And a story that has been processing these themes for 3,000 years has a depth of insight that a story written last year about the same subjects simply cannot match. That depth is what global audiences are responding to, even when they cannot name it, even when they experience it simply as the feeling that this story matters in a way they cannot fully explain. There is a third dimension here that goes beyond structure and timing. It is about the storytellers themselves, the generation of Indian authors and adapters and screenwriters who are doing something genuinely new and genuinely difficult. They are holding two worlds simultaneously: the world of the original tradition, its Sanskrit cadences, its oral rhythms, its cosmological assumptions, and the world of contemporary global literature, with its demands for interiority, for psychological complexity, for the kind of close attention to individual consciousness that modern readers have been trained to expect and require. The writers who are succeeding at this balancing act are producing something that has no real precedent. Books that feel ancient and immediate at the same time, that carry the weight of tradition without being crushed by it, that speak to contemporary concerns without abandoning the metaphysical depth that makes the original material so extraordinary. This is not easy work. For every author who successfully bridges these worlds, there are many who fall into two traps. The trap of reverence, treating the material as too sacred to reimagine, producing work that is culturally authentic but narratively inert, or the trap of exploitation, using the aesthetic surface of Indian tradition while gutting its actual substance, producing something that feels exotic but means nothing. The authors who avoid both traps are the ones changing the conversation, and increasingly they are finding audiences that were waiting for exactly this, that knew something was missing from the stories they were being given but could not have articulated what that missing thing was until they found it. But there is an honest complication to this story that deserves to be named. The globalization of Indian folktales is not a simple triumph. It carries within it a set of tensions that the publishing industry is only beginning to grapple with. The oral traditions from which these stories come belong to specific communities, to the Adivasi storytellers of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, to the Baul singers of Bengal, to the Theyyam performers of Kerala, to the puppeteers of Andhra Pradesh, communities that have maintained these narratives for generations under conditions of profound economic and social marginalization. When those stories are extracted from their communities, dressed in the language of contemporary literary fiction, published by global houses and celebrated as world literature, the communities that kept them alive often receive nothing, not credit, not compensation, not even acknowledgement that the tradition they sustained through centuries of difficulty is the source of the value that others are now monetizing. That is not a small problem. It is the same extractive logic that has always characterized the relationship between the powerful and the periphery, just wearing different clothes in a different century. The authors and publishers who are doing this work with integrity are the ones who acknowledge the source, who find ways to bring the originating communities into the conversation, who treat the tradition not as raw material to be processed, but as a living inheritance to be honored. The ones who do not are producing something that looks like cultural celebration and functions like cultural theft. The global audience consuming Indian folktales
deserves to know the difference and to ask occasionally where exactly the story came from and who has been keeping it alive all these years while the rest of the world was not paying attention. There is one more layer to this, the one that operates beneath the publishing trends and the streaming deals and the literary prize nominations. Indian folktales are becoming global bestsellers at a moment when the world is experiencing a particular kind of crisis. A crisis of meaning. The dominant secular, rationalist, progress-oriented narrative of Western modernity has produced extraordinary things. Scientific advancement, material prosperity, the expansion of individual rights, and it has also produced a profound hunger for something it cannot provide. A sense of connection to something larger than the self. A relationship with time that extends beyond the individual lifespan. A cosmology, a story about what the universe is, what it wants, what we owe each other, and the world we inhabit, that feels true in the way that facts alone can never feel true. Indian folktales carry all of this, not as doctrine, not as religious instruction, but as the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that has been asking the deepest questions for the longest time and has developed a remarkable set of narratives for living with the answers being always incomplete. The concept of Maya, of the world as layered illusion, speaks to something contemporary audiences feel but struggle to name in an age of algorithmic reality and digital simulation. The figure of the trickster god, Krishna's playfulness, Narada's mischief, offers a relationship with the divine that is irreverent and intimate, that refuses the distance of a purely transcendent deity and insists on engagement, on laughter, on the sacred being present in the mundane. The Panchtantra's animal fables, stories about power and betrayal, and the wisdom of the small against the arrogance of the large, speak to a political moment in which audiences everywhere are trying to understand how power works, how it corrupts, how the vulnerable survive it. These stories are not being consumed as exotic entertainment. They are being consumed as medicine, as maps, as the kind of narrative nourishment that people reach for when the stories their own culture provides have stopped being adequate to the scale of the moment. What is happening with Indian folk tales in the global literary marketplace is not a trend. Trends reverse. They fade when the novelty exhausts itself, when the next interesting thing arrives from somewhere else. What is happening here is a reckoning. A slow, irreversible recognition that the archive of human storytelling is vastly richer than the dominant tradition had acknowledged, and that the stories that survived the longest, that outlasted dynasties and colonization and the homogenizing pressure of global monoculture, survived because they contain something that human beings seem to not stop needing. The grandmother in the village in Rajasthan who has been telling that story for 50 years without a publishing contract or a literary agent or a single review in any journal, she always knew that the rest of the world is finally catching up. And in the catching up, in the moment when a reader in Stockholm or Sao Paulo or Seoul finishes a story rooted in a tradition 5,000 years older than their own city and sits for a moment in the particular silence that only a true story produces, something shifts. Not just in what they know about India, in what they know about what stories are for, and what we are all, still, in every language and every century, trying to say to each other in the dark.